No one can make sense of the Holocaust, yet in the very speaking of their experiences, children of Holocaust survivors begin to find wholeness in what is broken. As they hold to the light pieces of their individual histories, something unnameable is restored. It is in the warmth of this light that children of Holocaust survivors pick up where surviving parents left off, by grieving the history they longed for and owning the one that is uniquely theirs.
When I come, it's not like I'm coming to talk about the Holocaust. I'm coming to be with all of you. Because I feel very nourished and somehow comforted.
Safe.
Yeah, safe, and
pretty
there's
safe.
something soothing and something understood and uplifting about being with everybody. It's kind of like I've come home or something.
It evolved into what Ellie said, into sort of, I really feel very comfortable with the people in the room and have a sense of that, of commonality, or there's a certain kind of intensity or mishigas or craziness that I feel very comfortable with.
Well, you know, it's like
And feel very familiar with, very safe. I sort of
you get to feel understood. Yeah.
Like there's a part of me that you people understand that even probably my husband doesn't really understand,
Right.
except he lives with it.
Right.
But I don't think he quite understands where it comes from.
Right.
But since that time, I have felt like, you know, understood and safe, and just I like the feeling of the group, and I hear things, and you know, I'm learning things, and you know, when I think about my life, where do I get to spend any time during the month on this?
I think that's why we come. I don't know that we've necessarily found what we need to find, or in fact maybe we never will. It's not a goal-oriented experience, but just one that we do because we have a need to be with each other. And that's how I feel as well. That's why I come.
My mom, who's still alive, she was born in 1915 in Tomaszów Mazowiecki, which is a town 40 miles southwest of Warsaw. And my dad was born in 1911. He passed away 2 years ago. And, you know, my dad's family was, you know, they were merchants. His dad was a manager in a lumber factory.
Both my parents were born in Poland, and my mother, I think, was more in a kind of, I would guess, more of a city atmosphere, and her parents owned a bakery, so they were merchants. And my father was more out in the country, I get the feeling. I think he was more on the border of Czechoslovakia, and they owned a grocery store.
My mother was born in Pabianice, Poland. It's a small town near Lodz. Her father was a painter, and he had a small painting business that he owned himself. And they weren't well-to-do, but they were comfortable. And she had two brothers, Aaron and Moisha.
He was from a town outside of Krakow named Wieliczka, and his parents owned a large furniture store.
My father was born in Nowa Wielka, which is a little town near Vilna, Poland. And there were 8 kids in the family. His family owned a bakery and a little store.
My mother was born in Hungary in 1909. And her family was, I guess, like a well-off family. They had lands, they had factories in like rural Hungary. So they were like the, you know, deep people in this little village.
My parents were both from Poland. south central part of Poland. My mother from a pretty good-sized city called Częstochowa. My dad from a much smaller city or town called Bedzin.
They were from Poland. Both of my parents are from rural area of Poland. He came from some town outside of the city of Lublin, and it sounds to me like it wasn't like a tiny town, but maybe a large town or small city or something like that. My mother also came from a town in Poland. I get the feeling it was a more rural area.
In my family, the Holocaust was not something we talked about. It was something we knew that happened. It permeated every cell of our existence, but it was the big hush-hush. It was the horrible thing that happened to her that we all had to tiptoe around and never talk about.
Mostly, I just understood that it was a very painful and difficult topic, to say the least. And I didn't want to be the source of that, bringing back those memories.
Not as far as I know, never, unless he had private conversations with my mother. I never heard him speaking about it. He didn't have a tattoo, but somehow I was aware that he was a survivor. And it's curious to me how I knew that. I mean, there wasn't, to my knowledge, Holocaust literature in the home. There were no references made to it. There was mostly silence around the issue, but somehow I knew.
You know, I remember always knowing, I remember it being a part of my life. I remember all the other families being around, and they were all survivors. So I always knew my parents were survivors, but they didn't actually tell us stories. And it was only when I got older and started realizing that, you know, what was going on, that I started asking questions. At that point, my mother couldn't talk anymore. She had had a stroke. So my father, he could handle answering questions for about 2 or 3 minutes, and then he would say, okay, enough already. And so I just kind of would eke out pieces of information that way.
Never. Never was mentioned in our house. I think since very, very young age, we got like a message, don't ask. So I knew that she was, but that's about it, nothing more than this.
But I think there was just this emotional heaviness or tension, and I think that in my parents' case, that was created a lot by what they had been through and what they lost. And again, what they lost never got talked about very much directly, or not in the sense of actually talking about the loss. It's like we felt the loss, but it wasn't really talked about. My father's stories were about survival, and even if he would mention, even when he mentioned who he lost, it wasn't like the sadness was then that he'd cry and say, oh, I lost my sisters, I lost my parents, I lost my grandparents. He never said that and cried. He would just then sit quietly for hours.
My dad spoke about the Holocaust almost incessantly. His memory was crystal, and so he was able to remember the most minute details, the names of people, you know, in terms of, you know, people, how they looked and the smells and just everything. It was just incredible, you know, the detail of his memory.
I knew growing up that my family was different than the family of my friends. First of all, my parents spoke with an accent. They were from a foreign country, and I had no relatives. I had no grandparents. I just remember being very conscious of that. during holidays. And of course, Thanksgiving was, to my parents, I mean, we had Thanksgiving because my brother and I have an older brother, it's just the two of us, wanted to have Thanksgiving because everybody else did. And, you know, you made turkeys in school and stuff like that. But, you know, my parents were, what's Thanksgiving? And but they did it anyway.
I knew that I was somehow different than other kids, and I did feel different, mostly because of what I felt inside, not because of that people would notice it about me. But, for instance, when we were little, they did have movies about the Holocaust in school, the 8th grade or the 9th grade. And I remember, I think somebody came and got me and said, you don't have to watch this. And when they brought me out and I sat in a hallway, like waiting for the movie to be over, you feel pretty different. One, because it's painful, but you kind of do know what images they're showing. You know, piles of skeletons being thrown in huge craters. You know that that's what happened to your people. But additionally, you know, you're the only one that's sitting outside the classroom. I did live in a Jewish area, but there were no other survivor children there. So, you know, you go back into the classroom and you suddenly feel like everybody's looking at you like, oh, you know, she had to leave because her mom was there. So you do feel different.
We will take a typical family where we were. We're in kibbutz in Israel. You know, most of the people had the same, let's say, country background. All came from Central Europe. Some of them were to Holocaust. Some of them came before. So then their family were in the Holocaust, something. So I think, yeah, in general, you know, I had the same, just like everybody else. I didn't feel different, or we didn't have any separation between people that the parents were in the Shoah and kids that the parents did not go to the Shoah.
So I had a real interesting, you know, thing. I was an immigrant kid. I was, you know, learning English when my parents were learning English. And so I had to translate stuff for them when I was like 7, 8 years old. Any document that came into the house that was official, you know, government stuff. You know, I did that, and you know, there was a lot of pressure on that level, but I was a lot of times I was you know, ashamed initially, because we were very different. You know, there was like, you know, the house was different, it was smelled different, the foods were different, the language was different, what they spoke about was different. So I remember not wanting to bring my, like, quote unquote American friends into the house. And it was uncomfortable for me. I didn't even know how to explain at that young age what was happening, but we were different.
I feel that I have a lot of grief for, I was going to say my father's family, but it's really my family that I lost. And that makes it a lot closer to home when I say that it's my family. And for many years, I'd always say my father's family because I'd never met them. But then especially after being in this group, it's my family that I lost. I lost grandparents that I never met, that I know had to have been loving people because my father's such a loving person.
You know, not having an extended family when I was a kid wasn't as much of an issue, because when you're a kid, you tend to think, well, the whole world is like your little corner of it. And because a fair number of people in my immediate sphere were, you know, didn't have large families, whether they were survivor families or not. It was only really later, as I got out more into the world and interacted with other families, non-Jewish families, or just families that weren't survivor families, that I came to understand what having an extended group in your family was like. And in retrospect, I miss that a lot.
It's almost as though, you know, the body of the family had a severed limb that you just got along without. And there was phantom pain that you just learned to tolerate.
This picture is the most chilling to me because these are my grandparents, and I look at them and I'm looking to see my mother in their faces, and I never ever had any idea of who they were or what they were like. Do they look like me? See, we learn to not even believe that these people have existed. They're just this idea. They're an idea more than they're people. Because if they become people, then the loss is enormous. But if they're just an idea, then you can separate yourself out and defend against all those feelings of sadness and loss. But if you let it in, it's really horrible. It's, you know, it's a bigger loss than you can possibly explain.
We had the group, so all holidays were celebrated with the gang. All the families got together, mostly at my mother's house. You know, we opened the table up and 25 people all around the table. And that's what I knew of as family. Their kids were my friends, and we all hung out together, and that's what we did.
And she came like so inappropriately. She was just in her house coat. Not that we got really dressed up, but because it was just us, but you know, you'd usually come to the Seder kind of looking kind of neat and clean in whatever you were wearing. And she came in her house coat and it was open, and she had just this sort of long line Playtex, you know, brassiere and girdle that she used to wear because she wanted to whatever, but she was inappropriate. She was clearly emotionally distraught and like something was really bothering her. And of course, I don't know now what was wrong, except that she came and somebody asked her what was wrong, and she went on to say in Yiddish, you know, Hitler didn't save us and didn't save her family, and why are we talking about this exodus? Right now, we weren't saved. And she just, you know, so what was supposed to be, you know, I mean, typically the Passover Seders were supposed to be happy or fun occasions. They were, and again, this one in particular was, I don't know what the word is, but sort of imbued with with the Holocaust.
Well, I think of myself as a survivor, or at least the child of a survivor. And, you know, there's a way in which I feel like a warrior. And I don't know how much of that is related to being a child of a Holocaust survivor as it is being a survivor of parents who died at an early age. You know, it's hard to separate out what influence that had, but I've been, you know, self-sufficient and fairly independent for most of my life. And when I think about, you know, something that's challenging or struggle with something that's challenging, the first thought that comes to mind is, this isn't nearly as hard as it would have been to survive what my dad survived, so I can do it. Yeah, I think his decision to kill himself had everything to do with his experiences in the Holocaust. When he learned that my mom had a brain tumor, he became depressed. And actually, the tumor didn't kill her until 3 years after she was diagnosed, but he killed himself a year later. And I guess what I've come to learn, some of what I've been told, what I understand is that the fear of her death just resurrected all of his memories of his earlier losses, memories that came to him as nightmares during that last year especially, but maybe even before, that he could no longer, keep underground. And so, when I react with anger about his suicide, which was my first reaction, thinking, well, how could he leave? How could he leave us all? How could he leave my mom, while she's dying? How could he leave his kids? I don't allow myself to feel angry for very long, before I think about all that he suffered and how he couldn't, how he couldn't hold it, how he couldn't bear it. And that's the grief that I've on the one hand really wanted to get to know, and on the other wanted to protect myself from.
My mother was the only person to survive. And when I think about that, an image comes to my mind, and that is for this Thanksgiving dinner, big table where everybody's sitting around the table, 50 relatives, your extended family, they're all there for the holidays. And you're a 10 or 12-year-old child watching the family have this wonderful dinner. And somebody comes in with a machine gun and right in front of you shoots everybody in front of you. They're all dead and you're the only one that's surviving. And that's what I think of when I think of who my mother is. This child that had it all taken away from her right in front of her eyes and is witness to this and has to then go on and have a family of her own and a child of her own and do what's expected of her and be responsible and be polite and be civilized and be generous and be all these things when an unfathomable terror happened before your eyes that you can never write. Just how terrifying that experience had to have been for them to then be expected to have any semblance of a normal reality. And then for me, growing up with that person so wounded, for me to have a semblance of a normal reality, it's all I could do to struggle against it and find that normal reality every day. Because the not normal reality always creeps in.
I think I feel anger that I could not ask and could not kind of connect to the past, to my parents' past. I feel it was wrong of them to maybe don't let us see their past. In general, not even with the Shoah, but at all, it was kind of like it didn't exist. So kind of like living in open air without any base.
I was so shut down emotionally too. I think that, I remember when I was 20, I went to my first therapist, and what I told her, I remember saying is, I come from a happy, healthy family, we don't have any problems, but I want to be a counselor, and I was told this would be a good idea. And I was so screwed up. I was really screwed up. But that was my experience of my life. So, I mean, when you talk about denial, and I don't even know if I knew what a feeling was at the time. I remember later on being in a kind of therapy group and feeling angry and noticing, oh my God, this is a feeling. And it's not that I didn't get angry. I used to yell and scream at my brother all the time. But I don't think that I was completely out to lunch.
My mom was just always, is, she's still alive, but was always, as I was growing up, and remains a complete optimist, and would always remind us, how fortunate we are to look for the things that we have to be grateful for. And she never referenced, because she was, in a sense, incapable of referencing her Holocaust experience. So she would never say, like I knew any number of my friends, parents would say, be grateful because we all almost died. We had nothing, and so any number of maybe perfectly legitimate things or justifiable things they might have said. But she would always say, just be grateful and happy for the things that you have.